Sorry, Brian. We needed
Sorry,
it in a different manner there. You're good.
The session from 4 to 4:50 today, and thankfully it's the end of the day, is entitled "The Federal Budget and Student Aid," is being presented by Rachel Gentry. And Rachel Gentry contributes to NASFAA's policy and advocacy efforts, representing the association before congressional members and staff, and working to enhance the advocacy capacity of its members. Prior to joining NASFAA, Rachel worked in higher education policy analysis in Washington, D.C., and began her career in higher education as a high school college advisor, assisting low-income and first-generation students through the college application and financial aid process. With that, go ahead and take it away, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Brian. I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, that coming through okay?
Looks good to me.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for the opportunity to spend a little time with you all. I know it's towards the end of the day, so hopefully you'll find what we talked about with student aid and the federal budget interesting as a way to cap off your Monday. My name is Rachel Gentry, and I sit on NASFAA's Policy and Federal Relations team, and part of my role is working on all of our advocacy around the federal appropriations process and making sure that the federal student aid programs receive robust funding increases year after year, because we know those increases are so important to sustaining the aid programs that are critical to our students enrolling. So excited to talk with you all a little bit today about kind of how the student aid is impacted by the federal budget and appropriations process. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts of the federal budget, give a bit of a step-by-step budget 101 for those of you who maybe don't follow the process as closely, which I can certainly understand because I know you all are busy on your campuses and it's kind of can be a complex process to keep up with, but I'm going to give a little bit of kind of an overview of what the federal budget and appropriations process looks like. I'll talk a bit about sort of the politics that are shaping the budget landscape today, and then touch a bit on what happened for fiscal year 21 appropriations, which we finished up in December, and then talk a bit about where we're going for this upcoming year, fiscal year 2022. And then end with talking about NASFAA's work on budget and appropriations. And we'll definitely happy to take questions towards the end, whether it's about the just budget and appropriations process in general or specifically NASFAA's work in this area. So I want to start with giving just a bit of an overview of sort of all the different buckets of federal spending. I think this is, although many and most of these fall outside of the federal student aid programs and federal higher education spending, I think it's important to kind of see an overview of all the different areas that the federal government is spending its money, because this kind of gives you a sense of the different programs and issue areas that the student aid programs are sort of competing against for increases in the appropriations process each year. So you see things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security that take up a huge portion of total federal spending. What you see on the screen right now is broken down by category for the fiscal year 2017. You see that the Department of Education, that light orange sliver, in 2017 made up just 2% of federal spending. You see things like defense discretionary spending, that's about 15%, non-defense discretionary spending, which are things like public health programs, transportation, agriculture is about 13%. And then again, just 2% for all federal spending for the Department of Education in that fiscal year. This is a more recent look at the federal budget. So this is for this current year that we're in, or that we just finished, fiscal year 2021. Again, we're seeing around 2% is what the education accounts are coming to. So roughly fairly similar to what we saw in that 2017 graph on the last page. But again, just 2%. One of the coalitions that NASFAA works closely with, that I'll talk a little bit later, has really been advocating year after year to see that 2% of federal spending, see that number go up to around 5%, which would really bring some substantial increases to the student aid program. So I think it's kind of important to understand all of these different areas of federal spending, because at the end of the day, while we're definitely pushing for increases in the Pell Grant program and SEOG and all of the programs that you all work with and our students benefit from each year, it's in order to obtain those increases, we have to see just education in general get a bigger portion of kind of bigger slice of the pie. And so just want to kind of start by contextualizing all of the different areas that we're seeing government spending and how we at NASFAA kind of think about pushing for increases in our slice of the pie. So this is an overview of how the annual budget and appropriations process should work. I'm going to go through each of these and talk a little bit about what happens in each of these phases. So starting with the president's budget request. So each year, the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the executive branch, works to prepare what we call the president's budget request. This is typically released in early February. This is a document, it's typically lots of documents, but as a whole, this publication includes kind of what the administration's spending priorities are. So for President Biden, it includes all the things that the president and the administration want to see the federal government spending their money, new programs they want to see created, increased funding for existing programs. We typically see this come out in early February. I'll talk a little bit about the most recent requests that we saw from President Biden this year. During years where there's a presidential transition, we typically see the president's request come a little bit later. So we didn't see President Biden's request come until May of this year. But this essentially, this request is sent to the congressional budget committees that kind of says, hey, Congress, here's what we would like to see you all do in appropriations this year. Here's what we care about. I think that it's important to note that the president's budget request, although, at NASFAA, we're keeping an eye out for it each year, and certainly folks that follow federal budget and appropriations are looking to that request each year. It's really more of a guide. It's kind of just an indication. It's kind of a messaging document for the administration to say, this is what we want to see Congress prioritize and how we want to see appropriations shake out for the year, but it actually doesn't have any kind of legislative power. This is really important when you think about when we've had previous administrations who have proposed really dramatic cuts to the federal student aid program. So a couple of years ago, we saw former President Trump's budget request propose eliminating programs like SEOG, flat funding, eliminating public service loan forgiveness, flat funding, things like the Pell Grant. We saw that included in several of his budget requests, but at those same years, we saw Congress actually vote to increase federal student aid funding. So the budget request is, I think, it's certainly an important document. It's one to kind of get a sense of what the administration is prioritizing. But if we see, a large cut or even a significant increase included in that request in a specific year, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to actually be signed into law for the next fiscal year. The second step in the process is Congress passing what's called a budget resolution. So this is a piece of legislation that is passed by the congressional budget committees. So typically those committees take the budget requests that they've received from the president, they put out statements on various components of what was in the president's request, and then they draft these budget resolutions. These are also non-binding documents. They are not, they don't have statutory legal authority, but they, again, sort of serve as kind of a high level marker, an indication of budget priorities in each chamber. So this is a document that from the Senate Budget Committee's budget resolution will say, here are the things that we want our appropriations committees to focus on. Here are the kind of policy priorities of the chamber. There typically aren't a lot of specific numbers. There aren't specific funding levels included in a resolution, but it sort of is a directive to the appropriations committees who are actually kind of determining program level funding for specific programs and setting those funding levels. It's sort of this is the budget committees giving those appropriators an indication of where they want to see them kind of prioritizing. Again, not a lot of specific priorities or specific numbers included, but the budget resolution is sort of one more kind of milestone that we see Congress hitting before we really get into the thick of the appropriations process, which then leads to the third, fourth, and fifth step that you saw in that last chart, which is the appropriations process itself. So Congress, the budget committees pass their resolutions after they've received the president's budget request, and then things really go over to the appropriators. So the appropriators are the funders. They're the ones who are taking these kind of high-level ideas that the budget committee has put in its budget resolution. They're taking this the top line kind of amount that the federal government's going to spend, whether it's $2 trillion or $2.5 trillion, and they're assigning specific dollar values to specific programs. So they're the ones who are saying, not just saying we want to see an increase in federal work study funding, they're saying we're going to fund federal work study at $1.2 billion. They're really giving that specific dollar amount. So federal spending is broken down into 12 different categories, and each of those categories has a different topic. What that translates to is 12 separate appropriations subcommittees. So we have the overall, let's give an example on the House side. So we have the House Appropriations Committee, and then within the House Appropriations Committee, we have 12 appropriations subcommittees, and each of those subcommittees is charged with putting together a bill that provides funding levels for specific programs in their kind of topical area. So the subcommittees, and I'll talk a little bit about what this looks like on the education side in just a moment, but the appropriations bills are drafted by each subcommittee. Each of those 12 bills then goes to the full appropriations committee. Once the full appropriations committee has voted and approved that bill, then it goes to the House floor. And if a bill is passed, so if the House passes their fiscal year 22, all of their appropriations, then bills, the Senate and the Senate does the same thing, then there would have to be what's called a conference where the Senate and the House versions for the appropriations package are sort of reconciled and any differences are worked out. The last step of this process is when the new fiscal year comes around. The federal fiscal year runs from October 1 through September 30th. And so again, in this sort of theoretical, how the process is supposed to work, all appropriations bills must be passed and signed into law by the president by October 1st. If that doesn't happen, the federal government can't continue its operations because it would have run out of money. If there is no action on setting those spending levels, completing appropriations by October 1st, that's when we can see a government shutdown happen. So again, this is kind of the typical process. President releases the budget committees in the House and Senate develop budget resolutions. Then the appropriations committees sort of take those budget resolutions and translate them into specific funding amounts for individual programs. We see the bills passed by September 30th, and then the new fiscal year starts on October 1 with new funding levels for that year. So that's how it's supposed to work, but I think it comes as probably no surprise to any of you all that Congress rarely follows this process. So because just of the politics that we've sort of come to expect, the gears of this process really get jammed up. And there's really not a substantial or really meaningful kind of punishment for not following in that order, because there are some other tools at Congress's disposal if they aren't able to complete the appropriations process to ensure that we don't see a government shutdown. More often than not, we see Congress using mechanisms such as a continuing resolution or an omnibus bill that kind of help patch over when they're not able to pass separate appropriations bills. So sometimes because of the politics surrounding individual bills, or even sometimes the politics completely outside of the budget and appropriations process, it might be really difficult politically for the education bill to get through. But when it's wrapped into an omnibus, which is kind of a big package of spending bills, sometimes the negotiations and the compromise that comes through that process allows Congress to complete its appropriations work kind of in that big package rather than passing individual bills. The other tool that you see listed here is a continuing resolution. So continuing resolution is a piece of legislation that essentially just extends current funding levels through a certain period of time. So I mentioned that the federal fiscal year runs from October 1st through September 30th. So if what's happened this year, if Congress has not completed its appropriations by September 30th, they can pass a piece of legislation that says, we're just going to extend the current funding levels until this date. This, you can have a continuing resolution that extends funding levels for a full year. More often than not, we see Congress passing 1 or 2 or 3 month funding extensions just to kind of buy themselves some more time to work out, keep negotiating and work out any compromises and negotiations that need to happen. I want to talk a little bit about kind of why it can be problematic to not see appropriations completed through this typical traditional process each year. When we operate outside of this established process, it first of all just brings a lot of unpredictability to the process. So, I feel like each year we do lots of presentations at NASFAA for folks at states and regions, and we often hear kind of what's the status of appropriations for next year. Are we getting close? And it's often just really difficult to say. I think in the last 5 to 10 years, we've only seen Congress complete its appropriations process on time just 1 or 2 times. We're almost always seeing delays, and that makes it really difficult to predict when we're going to see appropriations wrapped up each year. Are we going to see it actually happen by October 1 when the new fiscal year starts? Are we going to see just a short delay? Are we going to see it not completed until the end of the year, or even past the new year? It's just really difficult to predict when we might see appropriations wrap up on a yearly basis. Congress acting late can have ripple effects on what's happening over at the Department of Education. One of the things that many of you probably remember from years past is delays in things like Pell schedules, because if Congress hasn't passed its appropriations bill, if that doesn't happen until the end of December, or sometimes even into the spring, Pell schedules for the following year are going to be delayed. So that's another problematic aspect of not seeing this process completed on time. And I would say lastly, just kind of more from a theoretical standpoint, failure to complete this process as it was sort of set up to and intended to be done so doesn't allow for the committee and for stakeholders, experts in federal funding to really thoughtfully and carefully debate what's in our appropriations each year. If we're seeing huge packages of 6, 10, or even all 12 appropriations bills passed as a whole, that's usually happening because there's a small window of opportunity, and we're not seeing each of those bills taken through the process to allow experts to really debate, provide input, and see the democratic process unfold as it should. So we talked kind of generally about what this budget and appropriations process should look like, and what it actually does often end up looking like. But I want to talk a little bit about student aid and the budget. So funding for our programs, this federal student aid programs, falls under the jurisdiction of the Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education's Appropriations Subcommittee, which is quite a mouthful. Typically, you'll hear this referred to as Labor H, just because it starts with Labor, Health, and Human Services. So if you hear me say Labor H, that is the appropriations bill that includes all of the education funding, including funding for federal student aid. The Labor H bill is very complex because it includes many really important programs in the same pot of funds. So in that Labor H bill, in the bill, which is the bill that includes education funding, all of the health programs, human services, and even all of the education programs, which is, not just higher ed, we're talking K-12, early ed, workforce. So there's quite a bit in this bill. And there's often some of the elements of the bill, even outside of higher ed and outside of education in general, have some controversial and very complex kind of politics surrounding those issues. Because of that, the Labor H bill is often one of the last ones that we see going through the process. I think it was a year or two ago, we saw the House Appropriations Committee pass 9 or 10 of its appropriations bills, but and Labor H was one of the last 1 or 2 to go through. So it's often something that we see happening later. One piece of good news is that most of the student aid funds are what's called forward funded, meaning appropriations for this fiscal year actually fund federal student aid programs for next year. So the fiscal year 22 appropriations bill will fund like the maximum Pell Grant and SEOG for the 22-23 award year. So while delays are not ideal because we want to see things like Pell schedules come out on time, we are fortunate that if we see Congress not pass its budget or its appropriations on time, for the most part, we at least aren't seeing students, not getting student aid funds on time just because of that delay. So another sort of wonky part of the budget and appropriations process is that there are actually 2 types of spending that are included in the federal budget. And our student aid programs, some fall into one and some fall into the other, and one actually kind of falls a little bit into both. So the first type of spending is mandatory spending. And this is spending that is governed by specific criteria that is included in law that has already been enacted So the mandatory spending is going to happen every year at an amount that's already set in law, and is not, it's sort of, I guess the best way to put it is that it's not at the mercy of the annual appropriations process. So these are things on the student aid side, things like direct student loans, Teach Grant, Iraq, Afghanistan service grants, and then part of what we call the add-on for Pell Grant funding. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. The other type of funding that we have is discretionary funding. And this is the type of funding that is governed by the annual appropriations process. So things like the Pell Grant, the other portion of the Pell Grant, SEOG, Federal Work Study. So these programs, the funding levels for these programs are set each year by the annual appropriations process, which dictates their discretionary spending levels. You see the Pell Grant on in both of these charts, because the Pell Grant is sort of funded by a combination of mandatory and discretionary spending. So there is a base, most of the maximum Pell Grant each year is made up of discretionary spending that's somewhere to the tune of $5,500. It goes up each year, and I can't remember exactly where we are now. And then there's an additional amount that is added on in mandatory funding. So that's why you see it on both sides. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of current trends. And I should mention that these are things that we've seen in recent years. I'll talk a little bit about kind of forces that are impacting this specific year in the budget and appropriations process that we're currently in for fiscal year 22. But these are kind of some overarching things that we've seen impacting budget politics over the last few years. So one is just the overarching theme of deficit reduction. Whenever any new policy idea is passed, but certainly in the budget and appropriations process, one of the first things that you'll hear is how much is it going to cost? Are there going to be other things included in the budget that are going to offset any new expenses? So if we're going to increase funding for this program, where are we going to find decreases? There's sort of this constant push and pull between particularly across party lines, some wanting to increase spending, others wanting to make sure that any new spending is offset by decreases in other areas. I'll talk a bit about this in just a moment, but this has really come to a head this fall as we've been talking about the debt ceiling, the federal government's debt ceiling, and that's approaching, and that's impacting kind of the current negotiations around a number of pieces of legislation, including fiscal year 22 appropriations. One of the other trends we've seen in recent years is politics around the budget dictating policy. So we've seen a number of significant student aid policy changes happen as a result of budget politics. We've seen things like the elimination of subsidized eligibility for the in-school subsidy for graduate students. That was included as a cost-saving measure. That was why that subsidy was removed as part of the budget process. Reduction in Pell LEU, the number of eligible semesters, was also included in a budget package. So, I think it's important to note that although we're certainly pushing for increases in this process, because of all of these different dynamics, we're also trying to make sure that we retain as many benefits and funding for higher ed and student aid as we're able to. And then the last thing, the last sort of trend is sequestration. So I'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. And some of you may be very familiar with sequestration, some of you may not be, but sequestration was a 10-year kind of cost-cutting mechanism. It was designed to achieve about $1 trillion in savings over a period of about a decade. These were essentially spending caps that Congress put in place for both discretionary and mandatory spending. So those two categories that we talked about earlier. Each year, if Congress had, for each of the 10 years that it had been in effect, if Congress had decided to stick with those, particularly on the discretionary side, which impacts Pell Grant, SEOG, Federal Work Study, if Congress had decided to stick with those spending caps that were put in place for each of those years, that would have meant some pretty major cuts to funding levels. What actually ended up happening is that Congress pretty much always voted to lift those discretionary spending caps, which is a good thing because we were able to get the increases to our programs that we were advocating for each year. But that certainly did add some stress and even more uncertainty to the annual appropriations process. So the good news is that sequestration, we often get asked, are we still experiencing sequestration? Has it gone away? The good news is that the sequester on discretionary spending that was impacting the annual appropriations process ended this year. So we're no longer gonna be impacted on kind of a yearly basis. That's definitely a good thing to have that behind us. And that was something that those of us who were doing advocacy around federal budget and appropriations is kind of a little bit of a thorn in our side. So certainly happy to see the discretionary sequester be phased out. However, we do still have a sequester on mandatory spending. So how things played out is that we, for a number of pieces of legislation in the last few years, including there was a budget deal that was struck the summer of 2019 that increased spending limits, kind of remove those discretionary caps for fiscal years 20 and 21. But when a deal like that happens, we would see the mandatory sequester extended for more years. So kind of in order to lift the discretionary caps, we'd see the mandatory sequester go even more years. The CARES Act included another year of mandatory sequestration. So all this to say, the mandatory sequester is still in place. It's currently been extended through fiscal year 2030. So we've got a good 8 or 9 more years to go on that. Because the mandatory sequester is still in place, student loan origination fees, the Iraq Afghanistan Service Grant and Teach Grants, all of those programs that are funded through mandatory spending will still be impacted. And so unfortunately, we're still going to see loan origination fees increase or be adjusted by a certain sequestration percentage on October 1 of each year, which I know is something that many of you probably are not excited to hear. NASFAA is continuing to advocate for the removal of student loan origination fees for many reasons, but one of which is that because they're impacted by sequestration, we know it's really just administratively challenging and confusing for students. So I'm going to move into talking a little bit about kind of where we are in the current process, what we saw in fiscal year 21 and what we are looking towards for fiscal year 22. So Congress finalized its fiscal year 2021 appropriations in December of 2020 as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act. This is the bill that included the second round of COVID relief funding. It was a huge omnibus package. It also included a number of FAFSA simplification provisions and other higher ed provisions. So a really massive bill. Kind of some highlights here. So the bill included about $73.5 billion in discretionary funding for the Department of Education, which was about a $785 million increase over fiscal year 20. So certainly a robust increase. We had a $150 increase to the maximum Pell Grant Award, which is the Pell for this current academic year that we're in, current award year. And then $25 million in increases to federal work study and SEOG. So in total, $25 million for the campus-based aid programs. I like this chart. It's one that our partners over at the Committee for Education Funding put together. It kind of shows you, even with the small increase we got for the department, this is overall education spending, we're still $7 billion below education spending after adjusting for inflation. We're $7 billion below where we were in 2011, pre-recession or during the recession. So I think this does kind of contextualize that although we see these increases to both the Pell Grant and annual and just overall federal investment in education each year, we're actually still a really robust, about 10% of the current of our current Department of Education allocation. We're still short that compared to 2011. This is essentially the same chart, but you see the three bars in blue here towards the right side of your screen. This is again the same chart, but the 3 blue bars show the President Trump's 2021 budget request, the amount proposed in the Senate and the amount proposed in the House for education. I just like to show this because I think it gives you kind of a good sense of how those different phases of the process that I mentioned at the beginning sort of play out. So the final amount that Congress approved for education, for the Department of Education, was about $73 billion. President Trump's budget request was $66.6 billion. So you see that even though we saw the president request a smaller allocation for education programs, Congress ultimately passed a much larger amount. You also see that the $73 billion that was signed into law is sort of right between the amount that was included in the Senate bill and the House bill. So I think that kind of shows you how each of the chambers comes up with their proposal, but at the end of the day, what we usually see is somewhere kind of in the middle. We see a compromise between what each chamber is proposing. So looking ahead to fiscal year 2022, which is started October 1 of this year, and I'll talk a little bit about where we are in that process. Wanted to touch on just sort of some of the factors that are shaping this current budget cycle. So I mentioned earlier that the discretionary sequester ended in fiscal year 21. So because that, those discretionary spending caps that were put in place in the Budget Control Act of 2021, those have ended. And so this is the first year that Congress isn't limited in how much it increases discretionary spending for fiscal year 2022. So this means that we're seeing the House and the Senate kind of decide what overall spending level they want to come in at. Another thing that is new as part of this budget cycle is that we're seeing the return of what has been called earmarks in the past. Earmarks were outlawed in 2011, but the process, earmarks are going to return in a process that's going to look pretty different. So they're now referred to, and the House is calling them community project funding. The Senate is calling them congressionally directed spending, but these will essentially allow lawmakers and members of Congress to request specific funding amounts that would be directed to specific projects in their home states or districts. This was a very controversial process before it was outlawed in 2011. There were a lot of concerns around corruption and wasteful spending. And so as the process has come back, we've seen a lot of sort of guardrails put in place. It's going to look really different than it did last time. There were just kind of an overall reform process. So all of the requests that lawmakers put in will be available online. There will be disclosures. There are the overall funding amount that can be used for these requests can be no more than 1% of discretionary spending. None of the spending can go to for-profit entities, and there are limits on how many requests lawmakers can put in. I think the reason I wanted to share this is because, higher education received a huge share of earmarks before they were banned in 2011. I believe it was over $2 billion per year is about what institutions of higher ed were receiving in earmarks last time around. And so, I think this is kind of going to be a new part of the budget and appropriations process. And seeing which of those community funding projects are requested by lawmakers that might actually end up benefiting institutions of higher education and students. Another force that's sort of shaping this year's process is all of the other things that are going on in Congress. So fiscal year 22 appropriations are happening while Congress is also working on things like a bipartisan infrastructure deal, a second budget reconciliation package, as well as the looming debt ceiling. So Congress voted for a short-term debt ceiling fix, so temporarily raising the debt ceiling until December. But there's certainly a lot of politics surrounding that, with Democrats wanting to make really substantial investments and increase spending on a number of programs. Republicans having concerns around the increase in the deficit. So we're going to kind of have to see how that plays out later this year. But obviously, if Congress, it's important for Congress to act and for us to not come close to that, to hitting that debt ceiling, because it would be difficult to disperse financial aid if, essentially the federal bank account doesn't have any money in it. So that's a significant thing that we're certainly keeping an eye on, is impacting all of the legislative proposals moving through Congress right now, including the appropriations process. All this to say, this sort of uncertainty and all these dynamics impacting the budget and appropriations climate is why it's really important that each year we are continuing to advocate for the value of increases in the federal student aid programs. So just an overview of where we are right now. So the President Biden released his budget proposal in May of 2021. Again, typically we see that come out in February, but it's pretty standard for whenever a new administration comes in. We typically see a delay in that request, the budget request, just because the president is staffing up. There are new people at the White House, some new folks at OMB, and so it just takes a little bit longer. So we saw that come out in May. We saw budget resolutions passed by the House in August. And then these steps 3 through 5 is kind of where we are now. So we've seen the House we've seen both the House and Senate subcommittees release their labor age spending bills for fiscal year 2022. Over on the House side, we've seen that bill be passed by the full Appropriations Committee, passed on the House floor, but in the Senate, we actually just saw the Senate labor age bill introduced last week, so we haven't seen much movement. Because of that, Congress did not complete its fiscal year 22 appropriations work by October 1, when the new fiscal year started. So in order to avoid a government shutdown, Congress passed a continuing resolution, which we talked about earlier, that essentially just extends current funding levels. So the levels that the programs were funded at in fiscal year 2021 are just now extended until December 3rd. That really, buys Congress a little bit more time, gives them a couple extra months to finish up appropriations. So that's kind of where we are in the process now. I want to give a little overview of what we saw in the president's fiscal year 2022 request. So I think this is an interesting year because we've seen, the traditional budget request, but we also, because we have a new administration coming into office, we've seen the president's kind of landmark proposals and other legislative proposals through the Build Back Better platform. So the American Families Plan, the American Jobs Plan. So it was a little confusing when the budget request came out because some of these things were truly, for the fiscal year 22 discretionary requests, and then some were sort of referencing things that we saw included in the American Families and Jobs plans. But the proposal included a $400 increase in discretionary funding for the maximum Pell Grant. If you take that increase for the fiscal year 22 appropriations and add it to what was requested in the American Families Plan, which was a $1,475 increase. In total, the administration has proposed a $1,875 increase for fiscal year 22. This would be academic year 22-23. So that would boost the maximum award to $8,370. So again, $400 discretionary increase, but in total, a $1,875 boost. The president's budget also included or requested $3 billion in discretionary funding for the Pell Grant program. This is important because in years past, we've often seen increases to the Pell program paid for by pulling money from the program's reserve fund. So when there are leftover funds each year, they go into a reserve fund that is then available for when we it's kind of like a rainy day fund. Sometimes we have more Pell students enroll and more Pell eligible students apply for aid. And so we might need a little bit more than what Congress has previously appropriated. So it's really important to protect that reserve fund. And in the past few years, unfortunately, although we're excited to see annual increases to the maximum award, we want to make sure that we're not paying for those increases based on money that's already been appropriated by Congress, and that's in that reserve fund, and we need to protect for that rainy day should it come. So seeing that increase in discretionary funding means that we're paying for the increase in the maximum Pell Grant by new funding for the program, which is a really good thing. The Biden administration proposed level maintaining fiscal year 21 funding for SEOG and federal work study. You see on the right side of your screen, overall, a 41% increase for the Department of Education, extending Pell eligibility to DACA recipients. There was not a debt cancellation proposal, which is something the administration has talked about, and we've heard talked about a lot by members of Congress, so that was noteworthy. And then the budget request also reiterated the administration's free community college and MSI HBCU funding that were previously included in the American Families Plan. This chart shows what how the share of education funding that would be in place if President Biden's fiscal year 22 budget were to be passed. So you saw at the beginning of the presentation that currently education spending makes up only 2% of the federal budget. Under the Biden administration's fiscal year 22 request, education spending would make up 3.7%. So that is a significant boost. It's not the 5% that we're continuing to advocate for, but I think that shows that the Biden administration's request really was a kind of unprecedented and substantial increase in education spending. This is again, and this is just the request, we haven't seen anything signed into law, but This request, the Biden administration's 22 request, would boost education spending above the 2011 inflation or 2011 level in inflation adjusted dollars. So again, really historic increase. This shows the Biden administration's budget request kind of as it comparing to previous administrations. So you see that even administrations like former presidents like President Obama, who really advocated for substantial increases in education spending, this year, President Biden's request this year is even far above what we saw from President Obama. So really historic increase this year. I mentioned earlier that we have seen proposals for fiscal year 22 out of the House and Senate appropriations committees. We've seen their labor H bills, which again are the bills that include education spending. This chart kind of compares the House proposal with the Senate proposal, and then the Biden administration's budget request. So you see that the House, the total amount of funding provided to the Department of Education is the same in the House bill as what was proposed in the administration's budget request. It's a slightly smaller number over in the Senate. When it comes to the Max Pell Grant for the 22-23 award year, all three proposals include a $400 increase. I mentioned earlier that the Biden administration proposed level funding for SEOG and federal work study. That was something that we're disappointed to see. We always want to see increases to the campus-based aid programs in addition to increases to the Pell Grant. So we're excited to see that the House bill proposed a roughly $150 million increase to SEOG and about $2.4 million increase to federal work study. We saw increases in the Senate bill as well, although a bit more modest, around $25 million for SEOG and about $40 million for federal work study. So this is kind of where we are now. Like I said, the House, this bill has passed on the floor of the House. Over in the Senate, we just saw this text released last week. It's not expected for the Senate to really put this bill through the full kind of committee debate process. In the Senate, this is a very partisan bill with Democratic support. And so this is not what will ultimately be able to pass the Senate, because they will need Republican support in order to pass the bill. And so we're a long way, I think. Hopefully we'll see movement over the next month, but these are just proposals. I think the House and Senate numbers are likely, they're going to change, and we're going to have to see some middle ground, some common ground found. So these negotiations are ongoing. Party leadership are talking, how do these appropriations proposals fit in with all the other things Congress is working on with the reconciliation bill, the infrastructure package. So this is kind of where things stand now, and we're keeping a close eye, continuing our advocacy to make sure we're obtaining the biggest increases that we possibly can. So this I pretty much already went over all of this, but we'll continue to keep a close eye, publish updates in today's news, and continue our advocacy around budget and appropriations. One of the things that we've been engaged in for a number of months, especially over this last year, is a push to double the maximum Pell Grant. So we are part of a coalition that's organizing a double Pell campaign. This is a screenshot of this website, the homepage. There are a number of great resources on this page. Frequently asked questions, data, research related to Pell, student stories that really illustrate the importance of the program. And also there's a take action page that allows you to really easily contact your member of Congress, send a letter, send an email. There's social media resources. So this is really where we're putting a lot of our energy around budget and appropriations for this year, both budget and appropes, as well as the reconciliation process that's ongoing right now. This is a figure from one of our issue briefs at NASFAA. It's around double Pell, kind of just shows sort of the inflation in inflation adjusted dollars that the current maximum Pell Grant, once you adjust for inflation, really hasn't even kept pace with inflation. We actually see that the 1920 max award was less in inflation adjusted dollars than the 2009-10 max award. So those annual increases, although certainly appreciated and helpful in building momentum, really haven't even kept pace with inflation. Also in that issue brief, we have this chart that shows the share of cost of attendance that's covered by the 2021 maximum Pell Grant. and how much would be covered if we were to double Pell. So we're using resources like this to really enhance our advocacy efforts and really try to illustrate to members of Congress the important role that this program plays, and encourage them to include as big of a boost as they can in the appropriations process, as well as budget reconciliation. I think also really relevant to our work at NASFAA around federal student aid funding and appropriations is the coalitions that we work with. So we are part of the Committee for Education Funding, which I've mentioned a couple of times, that advocates for increases across the board in education spending. We're part of the Student Aid Alliance, the Double Pell Coalition, and we work with our partners at ACE and all the other higher ed associations here in DC in advocating for increased investment in federal student aid programs. Just a number of resources that we have if you're interested in learning more about our work on budget and appropriations. We have a interactive chart on our budget and appropriations webpage that kind of shows these different parts of the budget process that we talked about today. It has an archive of all of our news and the articles that we've written on the appropriations process over recent years. We have our Off the Cuff podcast, where we've recently changed up the format for Off the Cuff just a little bit, but we will still be having monthly kind of inside the Beltway updates, where we'll be giving updates on budget and appropriations. If you're interested in getting more involved in our advocacy work, I encourage you to visit our website and sign up to participate in our advocacy pipeline programs, join a policy task force, and always please keep us updated with what you all are doing. I know PASPA does a lot of great work around advocacy, and so if there's ever anything we can do to support your efforts in reaching out to your members of Congress, we're always happy to do that. And we've got some great resources that we can share to assist in those efforts. So that's all for me. I think we've got just a couple minutes left. I'm not sure if there are any questions, but happy to take questions or expand on anything. And hope that you all will stay in touch, and it'll certainly be a busy fall with budget and appropriation. So we'll keep you posted through today's news and other channels.
Thank you, Rachel, very much. I enjoy Off the Cuff, by the way. Are you going to be able to share the presentation with us so we can post it to our conference website?
Yeah, absolutely. I can.
Okay, thank you. You just send it to me or send it to Sydney, then to me, however you wanted to do that.
Great. Happy to.
Rachel, thank you very much for presenting. That was fantastic. I went to my first NASFAA leadership meeting. It was right before COVID, and I thought that was just incredible how NASFAA promoted up on the Hill for advocacy, and everybody went to the Hill, and we incorporated that here in PASPA as trying to make it mandatory that 2 or 3 people from our government relations group make sure that they attend every year. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to hear that. And I should have added a slide on that, and just a plug that registration is open for our leadership and legislative conference that you just mentioned. So that'll be in person here in DC. And I think it really is a great way if you're interested. I mean, the sessions themselves and the conference is wonderful, and encourage you to attend just for that. But it's also an opportunity, kind of seeing how things shake out with COVID and Hill visits. But it's a great opportunity to kind of dip your toes into the Hill visits, get some advocacy experience in a really kind of low pressure environment. We provide trainings and really try to support you and answer any questions that you have when you go up to the Hill to meet with your senators and representatives. So I think that's a really great way for folks that are interested in becoming more engaged in advocacy. Come to our leadership and legislative conference. It's really a great starting point. So our website has lots of information on how to register for that. But I appreciate that, George.
Thank you.
Doesn't look like we have any questions coming in. A lot of thank yous. Kat, you want to end the recording?
Well, I don't see anything in there, so I think that's it for today. Great job, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. I think we kick off, Brian, what, at 8 a.m., right?
I believe that is correct.
Damn bright and early. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. Hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see everybody tomorrow morning.
See everyone tomorrow.
Thank you. Good night.